So we have a speaker who has both tremendous knowledge and experience, and is someone I've known for a number of years. In fact, I think first I've known Dr. Innocent Batsani Mube. I don't say it very well, but I get at least an approximation. And who's an associate here at Ideas, originally from Zimbabwe. He was a lecturer in African politics at the School of Politics and International Relations at Queen Mary, and has researched on Africa, China for many years, on elections, worked worked on politics, African states' nuclear power projects. So it's a very international and diverse role. His research was recognized by the prestigious Early Career Research Prize in African Studies in the UK, and the 2024 African Studies Association Best Thesis Prize. It's also published received in 2023 the Journal of Southern African Studies Terence Ranger Prize. It's his forthcoming book, but I don't think this is correct because I seem to hold a copyright. So actually, it's a real book. It exists. It's not a virtual book. So many books that I see today are, in fact, virtual ones. It's a pleasure to be able to have this on hand. It's China and African parliaments. It's linked to the work he did in his thesis, but I'm sure it's developed beyond that as well. And I can say that this is a genuine, we often say there's work that is innovative. I mean, it's an overused word sometimes, but I think that you took an idea, this idea of the role of China as an actor in the African context. You asked questions that people hadn't been asking, a sort of material reading in some way that was maybe both. And at first glance, it's obvious one. It's like one of those ideas when you see it, you realize, well, why didn't I think of that? That seemed to be the way, and it became a way to explore the relationship that was both material but also ideational in that sense. So I just am very pleased to have him here and to have him speak on the subject. So I'll give it over to you for your talk, and I will make some comments, and we will then also introduce yourselves, since there's a few number of you, and we'll start from we'll have a discussion on that list.
Thank you, Chris. Was kind of, then thank you, colleagues, for coming. It's actually, so that you are here. So as Chris said, we're going to make the most out of it and have a probably more, deeper discussion. I want to try to engage you from the onset before I talk about the detail of my talk today. So if you can just pull out your phones, and you can just go to menti.com and then use that code to sign in. I'm going to play a small game.
Me too.
Yeah.
How do I do it? I don't believe it.
So you can just go to your let's see, which one is your browser?
This one.
Then you can say Menti. Then you can then enter this code, the 6562
9689. So 65629689.
Oh, 96, right? Sorry. 99689. Right. All right.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Everyone's in for now?
What we're we're doing right now, the speaker has been introduced, and if you would like to, we're just signing in on there as part of the talk.
So yeah, so well, let's just give you a minute to sign in. So this is the book. So the talk is based on this book, which was published this year. We've already spoken about it in terms of I look at China's relationship with African parliaments. China has been, constructing, rather financing, constructing, and maintaining parliament buildings for African countries, and they're delivered as gifts, are fully paid for. So I found it quite an interesting, research puzzle to engage in terms of why is China, a single party communist, state interested in, investing in seemingly democratic leaning, political institution. Particularly when you look at the fact that the genealogy of these parliaments in Africa, they come from, particularly in former British, colonies. So they come from a Westminster tradition. And so it was quite interesting for me to look at that. But that's just part of the puzzle. This other bit is why do ruling elites on the continent actually appears to receiving such symbolic gifts, such symbolic buildings, as gifts? Because you can imagine, like Westminster, a country coming and saying they want to donate a parliament building to the British, like we're going to say, like, why, right? Or Congress. So it was quite. So that's what made me to start to sort of like dig in. We'll talk more about that in the talk. So let's engage. Have you signed in, ma'am?
Yes.
Thank you. So we're going to play a small game. So you will see. So that is a parliament building. I don't know what you think about it. I would like you to look at it carefully for about 5-10 seconds. And then you are going to, you can just look at it again. It's also on your screen. Then when I move the slide, it will prompt you to a task that you're going to do based on this building that you see. So we've seen it, right? Let's move. Okay. Okay. Interesting that we got like different, looking at it's an imposing building. It's a grand, it's gigantic, it's concrete, it's expansive, it's intimidating. So that's one example of a parliament building that China constructed. You can see the scale of it, right? And sort of like I agree with all of you, the how you described it. So now the game is going to be more difficult now. Let's see. So there's that building. I mean, now we're in the interior now. So look at that building. The debate chamber. Sorry. Also, one parliament debate chamber constructed by the Chinese for an African country. So the question is, you have to pick the correct country, and in 10 seconds, it will just go away to show the answer. So you need to be quick now. So ready? Okay. Okay. So there's one person who got it right. Um, the, so let us keep tabs in terms of who got it right, because Menti doesn't show me who got it right. We'll see at the end, like whether there's a prize. Okay, let's go to the next one. Look at this one. That's also the interior. Okay, so you saw it properly, right? So you can. Okay, six players ready. Let's go. Mhm. Okay, now two people got it correctly. So I don't know whether the same person also got Lesotho correctly. So let's see. Let's get to the last one. Look at it again. Okay, let's go. Now we now know the rules. So um, you can figure out this one. A la Squid Game, right? Okay, it was obvious. It was obvious. This one was obvious. All right. So who got all the three buildings correctly? Anyone? Anyone who got three correctly? Anyone who got two? Okay. I mean, got two?
Yeah, two.
You got two as well? Okay. All right. We'll see. Uh, so thank you so much for playing this game. So yeah. Um, okay, let's leave this. So now, in this talk, so this talk we um, is so the title is Africa-China Relations and the Future of Democracy on the Continent. So I try to pull together something that would make sense for this topic, but also based on the book. So in essence, my headline argument, is that China's parliamentary infrastructure in Africa is a double-edged sword for democratic futures. Why is that so? Because it concurrently enables legislative institutionalization while eroding sovereignty. So that's uh, uh, how I respond to this idea of China in parliament and the future of democracy on the continent. So double-edged sword. And I'm just going to briefly go through and then we can have a discussion. So China's 100% financing construction and maintenance of parliament buildings across African nations. And at the last count, there are about 15 of them, 15 countries on the continent. It represents a strategic form of architectural diplomacy that simultaneously strengthens the symbolic significance of the institution and its substantive operations, while subtle embedding long-term political influence via ostensibly deliberate design flaws that justify ongoing Chinese maintenance. But uh, so the first thing that I want to say is why are parliament buildings different from other infrastructure projects? Because someone might say this is not really an interesting, a new thing, because actually China has been constructing many things on the continent. Stadium, stadia, government buildings, all sorts of things that China has been constructing. But why is it different when you look at parliament? So I was saying parliament differ from these other infrastructure projects for two reasons. First, from an institutional angle, parliaments embody a political institution that, in theory and performatively, imposes restrictions on rather than embellishes executive authority. Hence, investing in parliaments is inimical to the whims of the so-called authoritarian ruling elites, because some say that these vanity projects that China gives ruling elites, they're meant to pamper their egos, and also to ingratiate themselves to these ruling elites. But in fact, when you are doing that, the parliament actually, it restricts. If you strengthen the parliament, you're actually eroding authoritarian, tendencies by the executive. So this means that understanding the rationale for Chinese government investment in these buildings requires us to go beyond the usual characterization of China-Africa relationship as a perfect collusion between African and Chinese ruling elites. So that's the first one. The second one is that from a conceptual standpoint, parliaments are essential features of the modern state, and in that regard cannot be reduced to vanity structures. So they are actually functional. You might disagree in terms of their quality or in terms of the output, but every other country has a parliament. So contemporary parliament buildings symbolize the state, the people, and the political system. They represent and enable a complex state society, state society, and then legislature society dynamic. So the size, when you said earlier that building is imposing, is concrete, so the size and scale and aesthetics of the Chinese government-funded parliament buildings in Africa seem to correspond to the standard of structures of this magnitude. You can take that building that we saw. Yeah, it compares, well with what we know as these grand buildings of state, parliamentary buildings of state, like might not be as impressive as the Capitol, but it also, matches that level. So this means that dismissing these buildings as vanity projects obfuscates this more complicated reality. So utility of African parliaments to measure global actors, including China. Because before we talk about, what China is doing, like, why are these, African parliaments important? So Chris, who is like, our godfather in this area of China in the global south, he has written with his colleagues on how, this idea of China's turn from non-interference and their engagement more in security, on the continent, for example. So to this, I add that, so China, in my own work, I see China's focus on working closer with domestic political institutions in Africa, such as, parliaments and political parties. And why is it so? Because China has to contend with critical opposition parties and vibrant society and media. In addition, China tussles for political influence with Europe and, and the United States of America. Jointly, these actors challenge and question China's intentions in Africa and accuse it of promoting its authoritarian development path and undermining democratic governance. So the China must also deal with contemporary political change and governmental turnover in Africa. For example, while China's previous approach was characterized by exclusively supporting incumbent strongmen, this is now a major risk because owing to the consolidation of electoral democracy on the continent, elections in Africa now produce, at a minimum, multi-party parliaments, and at best, a change of party in power. For instance, between 2017 and 2021, elections in the SADC region, Southern African Development Community, ushered in 4 opposition political parties into government: DR Congo, Malawi, Seychelles, and Zambia. Added to this, constitutional term limits have enabled intra-ruling party leadership change. Also, from 2015 to 2021, all the SADC member states except Eswatini, they changed their head of state in government. So, which means that if they just, bet on the ruling elite, if they change, right, they would now remain in a very bad position. So Western states, rather, the realities have increased. These realities have increased China's cost of doing business in Africa. And now China is not the only actor, by the way, that has zoomed in on parliamentary engagement in Africa. Since the third wave of democratization in Africa, countries in the global north, intergovernmental organizations, democracy-building institutions, and not-for-profit have identified these institutions like parliaments and parties as central to nurturing and consolidating accountable governance. So all these organizations like the Westminster Foundation, Netherlands Institute for Multi-Party Democracy, actively support the development of democratic and inclusive parties. And they also support, in Zambia, for example, the Westminster Foundation for Democracy worked with the opposition United Party for National Development for 15 years until they got into power in 2021. So, since the emergence of multi-party African parliaments, they have been considered a valuable, important area of influence by international actors. Just to give an example, the Western donor nations have sustained their presence in the African governance architecture through parliamentary strengthening programs. For instance, notwithstanding the frosty political relations between Zimbabwe and the United Kingdom, the latter continued to support the Zimbabwean parliament. So African parliaments have also grown in political stature and importance in the last 2 decades. So there's like scholarship on African parliament, but there's also scholarship on China in Africa. So the idea is, so there are 2 things that are happening. So for example, Chris, wrote a very, seminal book on China and Africa around 2005. And then in the same period, people like Joel Bakan were writing about the growth of or the strengthening of African Parliament, the expansion through portfolio committees, bringing more scrutiny into the executive. So you see that China was rising in the continent around the same time, while African parliaments were consolidating at the same time as well. So now, the last point on this slide is that, to give you an example of parliamentary strength, improvement. In Zimbabwe, the constitution that was adopted in 2013, it provides that parliament has the power to control the declaration of war, to ratify treaties, approve loans and budgets. Might seem that it's on paper, right? But you should also remember that in the same period, Robert Mugabe was almost like forced, the ruler of Zimbabwe, the dictator who was ousted in a military coup in 2017. He was actually forced to, through a parliamentary motion to resign, as it were, right? He was supposed to be impeached, and then he had to resign when he saw that there were the numbers. So in a way, it might look like a lackey, but it sometimes it has tricks to buy, right? In Lesotho, only parliament can bring together under one roof the country's constitutional monarch, the executive, the judiciary, and members of parliament. And most importantly, the executive is drawn from parliament, and this leader, the prime minister, must command a majority in the National Assembly. These examples show that these are very significant institutions that are growing. Right. So, what about China? What they want from my own research that I've done? So, parliaments provide China with a strategic point to hedge political influence in Africa. So that image there of it's a you might not see it properly. It's called it says here. But Stockholm Parliament and Lesotho, it's like in Lesotho, and then it says the caretakers of the taking care of the new Lesotho Parliament building. So they are the caretakers of the new Lesotho building. So this is a compound that is on the foot of the Parliament, a hill. So they are there. So it's a Chinese construction compound. So they are there to do anything that is done, whether bulbs are needed. They are on standby. So they are sort of like construct and then maintain it in close range. But one of the things that we can say is the funding model that they adopted was that they would provide this as complete aid, and then they would control the tendering, and procurement. And it's important to note that in all the cases that I studied, the three of them, there were already plans that were developed, like plans to construct this parliament building by these countries. In some instances, in Malawi, for example, they'd even constructed up to first floor with money from Taiwan. But when China came in, they said, okay, no, we are taking over everything. We don't worry about these plans. We're going to come up with new ones. And also, if in the Malawi case, they deleted the involvement of Taiwan from that project, right? So this approach itself, and then again, the construction that I showed you, it actually gives you a sense of that the idea of being there is not just to give the gift, because if you give the gift, okay, you already have plans, let's actually try to support what you already have. So it's more like we have to do it in our own way. Now, towards the conclusion, I'll talk about two things, which is, I remember I claimed earlier on that I think that, this is a double-edged sword, right? So I want to say two things. First, the positive aspects of the buildings, and then the negative, what I might call the negative aspects. So the buildings, for example, they've enhanced the symbolic significance of parliament. Symbolic significance, as you say, you can see that the building is like, grandiose. It's like, quite impressive. It improves the cityscape. But most importantly, because I worked in those buildings in each building, I stayed for about 45, 50 days, trying to understand how the building works, in detail. I can say that, so the new buildings have contributed to the development of what I call a parliamentary ecosystem in recipient countries. So this parliamentary system, I conceptualize it as the presence and maintenance of a network of public officials and representatives that work in a defined space near each other in proximity and specializing in parliamentary activities. So some of the key indicators include the expansion of a specialized parliament staff cohort, the availability of space for the political class, to discharge parliamentary duties, and networking facilities such as lounges and dining facilities. Collectively, these aspects are indicative of embedding parliamentary practice in the case study countries. And remember, what the buildings that were being replaced, they were just a chamber, no working space. But I'm not saying that these buildings caused this planetary ecosystem, but I'm saying that it enabled it, right? So in Malawi, in Lesotho, they doubled the number of paramilitary staff. So there are now people who start their careers from university working in parliament, right? So it's more like this specialized civil service that focuses on parliament work. And parliament is a thing because also, some scholars say politics needs space, right? Politics is somewhere. You need to go and organize somewhere. Just like here we convene here in FAW90, so to do this meeting. So when you go there, you're saying I'm going to parliament, right? And so there's now legitimate expectation that the institution should also generate and regenerate itself, right? So that in itself is a good thing. Without boring you with legislative studies, lingo. So they talk about things like boundedness, things like internal complexity in measuring what is called legislative institutionalization. And when you are looking at that literature and seeing that the space itself, because it is coming in to do something that was not there, so it is actually doing something good. So you might say, well, if the institutions of democracy are being strengthened in being provided with a space to operate, so that should be a good thing, right? However, there are also negative aspects that, as I spoke earlier on, that the buildings. I'm trying to build this, and I might come up with a new paper on a concept that I call defective by design. Because when you look at these buildings, you find that the defects that warrant continued maintenance are not necessarily just out of like poor workmanship, right? So for instance, there was one example that I want to mention, the Malawi example. So that the building that I showed you, this one, yeah. You see that dome there, right? You see the dome. It looks quite impressive when you see it like that, right? But that dome leaks like a sieve during the rainy season, and so they always mount their scaffold. Their scaffold. Today I was looking for that picture, but it was in my old laptop, and I was like, I couldn't find my charger. Well, let me show you the scaffold, right? And so every rainy season, the Chinese have to mend it, and they've been mending it for over 16 years. So there's no final solution to mending the dome. It's an ongoing thing. So they're now used to it that the Chinese will come and mend the dome, right? And also one kind of interesting thing. Before I talk about the last quote today, in Zimbabwe, in the last, and this is the newest of them all, so it's more impressive, right? So the president was giving a State of the Nation address, and there was a power cut. So he had to finish by using a torch, right? And it's not the first time that this has happened in the building, it's the second time. And the explanation that comes from Parliament, they issued a statement which doesn't make sense because they say the actual grid, it was backup to a generator. So it isn't supposed to go the other way. Like the generator is backup, right? Not the national grid becoming a backup. So, so many people, when they saw that, they were just surprised. But I was not surprised because, I just knew, okay, but I need to understand, okay, why is the generator the main supplier of power in that building, not the national grid, right? But final story on this one, on how you can see dependence on the Chinese. So this is a quote from one of my, forgive me, I think I forgot to end quote there when I was clipping it. So one of my informant says, one of the Chinese ministers visited our country to visit these projects that the Chinese government are doing. They then requested the speaker to indicate if there are areas which the Chinese government can further help. So the speaker raised several areas. One of them being that the painting has worn off. So the Chinese thought to assist with paints that can sustain rains and harsh weather conditions. So you can imagine a sovereign country asking another country, can you please supply us with paint? And so it might sound silly, but it's that, probably they can't just start painting, right? Because if you start painting, like, say, why, what are you doing, right? So they'll have to ask to get paint. So those are some of the examples where defective by design that I mentioned. Now, so food for thought as we learned. So, and I'm trying to, stimulate, our thinking here around, for example, how and to what extent does China's investment in African parliaments reshape the coordinated democratic trajectory? As we mentioned earlier on, that there's a parts of the sword which sound positive, the other one is sound negative. Does this unwittingly push African states towards democratization? Because unwittingly, because China is not like, okay, kind of democracy enabler in real terms. And also unwittingly, by accepting this towards authoritarian resilience, this might actually be the case because, well, not the case, but this might be plausible given that if you want to look at the coordinate now, the elections that are happening, just saw what happened in Tanzania, so what happened in Mozambique, so what happened in Zimbabwe. You are moving towards that direction. Now, we're hearing problems again in Guinea-Bissau, in Cote d'Ivoire. So is there a pattern to pushing towards the authoritarian resilience? What about this impact on African state sovereignty? Does it reduce or reinforce it, right? So that's like food for thought as we engage. Now, last task that I have for you. Remember our thing. So I just want to what you make of it. So you can just answer that question as the last thing that we can do before our question and answer. Hey, can you give two more? So it was 6 years. Oh, we're now 4. Okay. So yeah, thank you so much. So there's a sense that most say this does, strengthen political institutions. At the same time, it also erodes the peripheral state's sovereignty. Okay, thank you so much for listening, and now we can engage.
Thank you. Let's first. I've got questions, and I want to maybe pick one of those. But I'd first like to since we're a small group, we're going to take advantage of that. Maybe go around the room and just identify yourself. Since it start on this side.
Hi, everybody. My name is Frederick, and I'm a student here at LSE in the Master's in International Political Economy. I'm taking Professor Alden's class in China and the Global South this semester. And actually, Queen Mary was where I had my first Africa and international politics class in my undergrad with Peter Brett, Dr. Peter Brett.
Yes.
And yeah, that's me.
Hi, my name is Goitom. I'm an Anthony Smith Fellow, visiting fellow at Policy Ideas. My research focuses on nationalism in Africa. Looking forward to knowing you all.
My name's Ebika. I'm an undergrad at SOAS. I'm studying politics and linguistics. I've been doing a module on China, and next semester I'm probably going to look more at China-Africa relations, but I've just been looking at a lot of China stuff recently, so it's been very interesting to me.
Yeah, thank you for the fascinating presentation. My name's Emily. I work in the Foreign Office. I look at China's foreign policy.
So might I start with the first question, which is to ask you about a little bit about practices like, I know we've talked about caucuses. We didn't really touch on so much, but caucusing in these places. So that very fundamental practice of democracy is, you know, stepping outside the formal institution itself where the voting goes on, but rather you trade discussions, and out of that you may build votes and what have you. Are the buildings enabling that? Are the buildings constricting that? Is there a pattern there, or is it I guess, is there some sort of pattern that you can discern from that, from the structure? Because we inhabit this space, and it creates a certain dynamic, if you like, of discussion and their power relations, you might say, et cetera. So I'm just your assessment of that, and does it hold for every one of those parliamentary buildings you should?
Thank you, Chris. So that's an important question. So there's caucusing, the formal part, but also there's also the informal part of, like, how does it enable interaction between, you know, parliamentarians, and, you know, in this thing that I mentioned, this idea of a parliamentary ecosystem, right? So dealing with caucusing, so yes, there are many spaces that, particularly in the Parliament of Zimbabwe and the Malawi Parliament, there are a number of those spaces to use for that. I think Lesotho, the building is like quite constrained in that it doesn't have many of those informal spaces. And particularly, I don't know why, because it even had a problem where it didn't even accommodate the Senate, which it was, Lesotho is a bicameral parliament. So one of the rooms that I use now as a committee room for such kind of things, it was supposed to be the Senate chamber. And the senator says, no, that is quite small. So they're not going to, they blamed the political elite, because senators are hereditary chiefs. So they said, you guys, you are the ones who told China to build it like this. So then it created this tension. So to answer your question, yes, there are spaces, particularly in Malawi and in Zimbabwe. And those spaces, for example, also there's a bit of hierarchy. In Malawi, for example, where I operated for quite some time, because the Zimbabwe Parliament was being built. So there's these dining areas. So also class system. So there are two dining areas. There's one, I went into both of them. So there's one with, you see there's linen, you know, like linen. So that's like the high end, you know, the big people go and eat there. The parliamentarians and also these other senior people. And then you can say the Vox Populi, the ordinary, you know, parliamentary workers, they go into their room. So this one is cheaper. Want to go lunch, it's cheaper here. Nicer gossip. That side, it's more expensive, but also with all these people saving, you know, stuff. And also you find this, again, sometimes you might find the Minister of Finance, you know, having lunch there. And so it's a very good kind of, because you don't necessarily get time to meet those kinds of people. So it's a good kind of environment for that, you know, in two places.
Okay, good. I've got other questions, but to any and all of you.
I just wanted to ask a bit more. You mentioned at the start about why countries are accepting these gifts. And there's the obvious reason that it's a free building that you don't have to pay for. But I guess, as you were mentioning, the kind of role a parliament has in governance in the state. So, and also many of these countries have a colonial history, and obviously China's not a colonial power and it's very different. But I guess why are they willing to accept another country offering such an important institution? And then just slightly separate question as well. You mentioned that China kind of dominates over the plans of these construction, but the buildings that you showed, they all look quite different. To what extent is that because of the agency of the country involved, or is that just because the Chinese construction company was different and had different plans?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll be quick. So, thank you, Emily. So, yeah, let me start with the design. Let me come to why they accept. So, yeah, so the designs look different. But there's something interesting about the you see this design, right? That's the Zimbabwe Parliament. Then you see this one. That's the Malawi Parliament. So they look, you see, like almost like there's some, because when I showed the someone this building, then they said, okay, why it looks like ours, right? So there is some form of some form of continuity. But the point that you make about the agency of these states, if you go to this building, you see that there's what I call the Great Zimbabwe motifs, right? That dominates the Zimbabwean state, kind of infrastructure. Great Zimbabwe, because Zimbabwe is the Great Zimbabwe, that's where the name comes from. So they say, when I was talking to the elites who were involved, they say the idea to build a parliament like that came from one of the founding nationalist leaders called Joshua Nkomo. He said that it has to have something like that. Then local architects, when they were asked to design this building in the 90s, they designed a building with those things, those conical towers. But it's a different one, right? And that there's a, what do they call it? A model of the building in the old parliament building. So I saw it as well. Then after that, the Chinese, when they came in, the Ministry of Public Works, they took them to Victoria Falls, where there's this, it's a resort, this place called Kingdom Hotel, which also has, those kinds of, design. And then, so this company that was assigned to, is Beijing International Construction Company, assigned, that got a tender from Ministry of Commerce in China to design. They designed 3 prototypes, all with the conical towers. And then they presented it to the Zimbabwe government to choose one. And now, when they came up with this plan, those original architects who designed the original plan, they were like, the Chinese might have, taken our design, right? So you don't know whether they really took their design or, it was because the Chinese side knew that the building had to have those features. Last quick example on Lesotho. So Lesotho, they had like come up with a square building. The architects in the building design services, which is the unit in public works, they pushed back. So they managed to get a concession from the Chinese, which was that the debate chamber would have, if you know Lesotho, there is this hat, it's called the mokorotlo, this big hat, right? So it's called the mokorotlo. So the chamber there was designed, the roof using a mokorotlo, and it was like a concession. So there is what you might call marginal agency of the local actors. And now to the point that you mentioned about why they are willing to accept, it's because it's presented as a gift to the head of state. So when you talk to the bureaucrats, you get a sense that their hands are tied by the fact that the Chinese government does not present this in essence as a building to the state. It's presented as a gift to the head of state, or in the case of Lesotho, the head of government. And so all the other agencies are supposed to operate and enable this gift, right? So although there is pushback, you find that because in the way in which it is presented, it actually limits the agency of the bureaucratic machinery of the state to insist on things that are supposed to happen, for example. So that's one of the challenges and reason why they accept, because it's presented at that level. Last point would be, when I was speaking to the Minister of Public Works in another country who was involved, he was quite frustrated because when now they were having a meeting with the Chinese to discuss the detail, so they would continuously refer to and say, no, we agreed with the president, right? And so when they say that, no, in African politics, when someone says that, like, you don't know, like, should you push forward, or if these people are going to go and say this guy is saying these things, and then you lose your job, right? So they always like use that card to say we agreed with the president on this. So that limits the agency of the bureaucrats.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. It was new material to me. And I'm from Ethiopia, so I don't think the parliament has been built, but the African Union, of course, has been built. And Chinese presence is very much felt across the country. In your talk, you seem to imply that this was strategically motivated by China. You didn't say it explicitly, but the purpose seems to be to exert influence of some sort. I'm curious about your thoughts on what methods or mechanisms of influence that they apply. Because given that this is a gift to, sort of the state and the people, I'm curious why, for example, after having received this gift, if the purpose is influence, the recipients won't simply rebuff or simply to, turn their backs on the giver, right? And so is the purpose like soft power? Is that like a method of influence, or do the receivers, is there some sort of material tit for tat in addition to this?
Yeah, thank you, Goitum, for that question. So the first thing is that yes, I believe that it's strategically motivated. Although like I said, I have the sense that my evidence shows that. You then say, is it soft power? Probably not. I sort of touch a bit in the book, but there's a paper I wrote for Third World Quarterly where I was teasing out this idea of whether it's soft power or what the American in policy circles in America call sharp power. So then I realized that probably there's a third way, and I was saying, first of all, to understand this third way. So because soft power, its premise is on attraction, right? And then sharp power, from how it has been conceptualized by, scholarship in America, possibly National Endowment for Democracy, those settlers, is that these institutions are perforated. And I don't think that's the case. So I see a sense of one element of ingratiation. So you need to go a bit into social psychology kind of literature around ingratiation. And sort of I'm building a model around, in that paper, also implicitly in the book, about what I call subtle power. So subtle power, which is the foundational remit of it being ingratiation. So you see, when someone ingratiates themselves, right, to another, they don't necessarily need to, once they achieve, like once they connect that ingratiation. So the ingratiatee is sort of like feels it. It's not like the ingratiator who then can tell you what to do, right? Sometimes even that person can actually go beyond what is expected because they feel obliged, they feel is what I'm supposed to do. So that in itself becomes sort of like something that, of course, is a concept still developed but in progress. That this idea of ingratiation is at the center of it, and you said quickly. You said also the issue of mechanisms of influence. Okay, I construct the building, and how do I see it directly? And I think, and this I think something that is puzzling for Western scholarship on this thing, because they'll run and look at UN voting and say, is China when they like do this, does do they force these African countries to to vote and all those sorts of things that in fact they'll see but they don't find anything. Why? Because China is not asking for anything, right? But then it gets everything. You understand? So China is not asking for anything, but because this is the relationship that is being built here. And final point on this is you have to track again why I believe that I'm saying that parliaments then become this theater. If you trace when the building is given to particular, let's say, leaders X in government, before around 2008, there was this anti-China sentiment on the continent, right? People like Michael Sata, for example, when they're campaigning. But now you find that the next government, you can have elections, right? But the next government become more embedded with the Chinese side than the previous one. So China is no longer an issue. It's no longer a campaign issue on the continent as it was. So it has diminished that idea of that we can find a government that is sort of like going to turn our backs on us, right? And that can be done systematically looking at all these cases. And final point is, if you look at transitions, every time you look at when a party goes out of power or a new president is voted in, the Americans are not there to welcome, to congratulate. The British are not there. Every time, it's the Chinese ambassador who has the first bite of the cherry. So they've like played this game in terms of maintaining relations across parties and also across governments as they go.
Can I add a question to that? Which is, does this, in a way, this embeddedness represented by the building crews that are Chinese building crews that sit there and repair, put in new light bulbs or plug the leaks every rainy season, what have you? Does this give them a relationship with the opposition or a good reading? Does this enforce a closer reading of domestic politics and understanding who's rising as a politician, who's falling? Does it provide any of those insights or the platform for those insights to take place?
Yes, thanks, Chris. So let me just put a caveat that if I say, okay, there's a relationship between the maintenance and the tracking of who is who, right? It might be sort of like the link is quite tenuous, right? Mm-hmm. Because they can do that through other ways in terms of like work that they do in the embassy. They can do that kind of work. Yeah. But the idea that they are there in that space, it itself, like it's like we are there because when they built this theater, they are signaling to the elites there, the poker elites ruling in opposition, that we have convened you. So without necessarily them saying anything, we have convened you. To the UNDP and other actors, like, Western donors, yeah, you guys can come in and train these people in other things, but you can train them in our place. And so they get a sense of we are there. We are also actors in this space. I'll give you a specific example that happened now after the book was published. Just a month ago. Is it a month ago? Yeah, a month ago. Malawi went to an election, and then they were going to this swearing-in ceremony. Only the Chinese ambassador to Malawi was, can I say invited, or because I might not know whether they invited or not. Only the Chinese ambassador to Malawi attended that event, and they were given an opportunity to address. No other ambassador. The only other high-ranking person who was there was the UNDP resident coordinator. And in that meeting, and you see, like, if you listen to the speech of what she said, the Chinese ambassador, it was like she was literally like giving like marching orders to this new cohort of MPs, promising this more like a state of the nation of some sort before the state of the nation. So they get that prime time in a way, and they get access to those.
Sorry to be greedy with another question, but I wondered what the kind of when the most recent building had been, because the ones that I'd heard of were kind of in the peak days of big infrastructure during the BRI, and you mentioned one being built 15 years ago or so. But I mean, I guess now that the BRI has shifted to small and beautiful, we no longer have so many of these big infrastructure projects. Is this more of a thing of the past, or do you think this will continue because there's so much kind of, I guess, political gain to be had from it?
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, it's not the past. It's actually going to the future. This building is actually like the most recent. They actually commissioned in 2022 in Zimbabwe, and it's going to be the centerpiece of the new administrative capital. And what's interesting about this building, it was constructed on top of Mount Hamden on Prayer Hill, where the Union Jack was supposed to be hoisted by Rhodes Pioneer Column. They got lost, and it was Frederick Courtney Solu who had been hired by Rhodes to point them there. He, after circumventing the material, he said, "Okay, I'm leaving you guys. You can now go." Then they got lost, like fog and stuff like that. Then they went to the copy, the other side of Harare. They mounted it there. So now the Chinese have done what the British failed to do. And the list that I was talking to, the Zimbabwe list, they're saying, we are correcting that mistake, right? So that's why they put that impressive building. There's another one that is coming up in Congo, Brazzaville. It's also a massive kind of structure. There's also another one, but this one is not a parliament. The ECOWAS building, they're completing it in Abuja now. So it's still those big, grandiose buildings, grand building as it were.
I know that Lucas Fiala is listening in. Sorry, did you want to ask a question? Why don't you go ahead and let Lucas, if you're there, we'll give you space to make a question afterwards.
Yeah, thank you for this. It was really interesting. I was going to bring it back to your point. You mentioned keep forgetting how to say the word integration thing. So would you say like, I'm not really familiar with how like the structure, for example, would look like in Parliament, because you said it's given us like it was to be like a gift, like these buildings. So from what you're saying, it seems like the head of state is the only person who really has final say on.
You speak up a little bit.
Sorry, so it seems like the head of state is the only person who has final say on whether or not to accept the building, and like everybody else kind of isn't really involved in that. I was kind of going to go back to that ingratiation thing. Do you think this has to do with some sort of like normative value I know obviously you just talked about the ECOWAS building, like it's happening everywhere in Africa, but is there just some sort of like, do you think it's just this psychological thing that's like allowing this kind of push into like African politics and this like I guess erosion of like full state sovereignty? Why do you think that is? Is it just this psychological thing, or could there be another factor?
That's a good question, Erika. So the first one is that, yeah, so when it's not just that the head of state is the final say, but I said it's presented as a gift, right? And sort of like as if it is a gift that is being given to the head of state, right? So, and from the case that I've studied, it's not like a case of whether, they're going to accept it or not, right? Because you see, the challenge is African states are operating in an international system where they are sort of outsiders, right? So that's the first thing that you're supposed to acknowledge. So they're outsiders. They are norm takers, not norm makers, right? And they are also coming in a space where, coming from the Cold War era, right, and quickly into the liberal order. Now, okay, multi-party politics, you have to do these kinds of things. Then things start to change. You find that the war on terror now, makes these countries to say, okay, we now want partners, but now the emergence of new donors such as China, right? So that overall context is supposed to be factored in terms of how, for example, a prime minister of Lesotho, towards the first FOCAC summit in 2005, when they're offered this thing, like, if they say no, like, in fact, they are not supposed to say no, right? But at the time when he was offered, he was actually the chair of SADC. So, and the Chinese wanted, that first FOCAC summit to succeed, right? So, in a way, you cannot, in a way, say no. The Zimbabwean parliament was also offered. Xi Jinping himself came to Harare en route to South Africa for the 2015 FOCAC summit. Just imagine. Xi Jinping is in Harare and he's saying, I'm giving you this parliament. You're saying no, like, you have been praying like for, like this kind of a big, breakthrough, right? So also the understanding of where African states are. Erosion of sovereignty, yes, and again, as we said, that when China funds parliament buildings that are meant to represent the state, right? And that symbolic building, what does it mean to the sovereignty of these African states that accept those kind of things? So, but then you should then also balance it with why they accept it, because they're not like, it's not fair to say they are Mickey Mouse. They can just but also the constraints that are involved. Last point. There's also an argument that of choosing between China and the West sometimes. And sometimes the West also, when African states are engaging with China and Russia in some instances, they think that it is an either or. No. In fact, some of the African states that, that I was studying here, they are willing to actually work with China and they work with the Western powers themselves. So they don't want to choose, right? So that dynamic, in terms of the psychological component, the norms, the normative aspects, are supposed to be factored in.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't want to keep asking questions, but I'm just going to say, like, on that feat, like, do you think there will be a point where Africa can really just kind of say no to things? I know it would be stupid to not accept certain things in I guess like with at the stage that Africa is after like, you know, how so much has been taken, I think that they kind of get into a position where they kind of have to, I guess I was asking about the structure of things because it was more like, obviously I know the head of state is just acting as a puppet entirely, but it's like, aren't there like people like below that that kind of question and think, oh, like thinking about Africa in the future and ahead, is there going to be a point where, you know, we're able to kind of have a bit more autonomy and like, you know, some sort of unity within Africa rather than looking towards, obviously I know in diplomacy and stuff, it's like looking towards the whole international scale, but do you think there's going to be a time where it's going to be Africa trying to like unionize within themselves, being able to say no to different values and stuff?
Yeah, it's as a philosophical question that actually might require another like research on its own. But again, and also because you can't know what the future holds. But the thing that we have to acknowledge is that we are living, for example, I said something like norm takers, right? So, for example, the world that we live in now was actually developed by the victors of the Second World War, right? So, and then later on, which then, you know, post-Cold War era, you know, US unilateralism and all those kinds of things. So even countries like China, with all their economic largesse, right? They're outsiders in this thing, right? So there's, in a way, to put it more bluntly, like there's old money and new money, right? So you have to understand where you are. So even China itself, within the context of, you know, center periphery arguments, right? It is not even in the center, right? In terms of global norms and, you know, kind of. So many people think that it's the US, right? But I think that no, actually, most of the time, you know, they're looking at the US, they're looking at the bigger superstructure. It's also like the Anglophone values, you know, drive this world, right? So this kind of, so as long as African states in that, ranking order, they are sort of like at the bottom of the table, right? So, you know, they can have what we call marginal agency. And there are some scholars who, like people like Francois Bayer, who talks about extraversion, utilizing the, you know, dependency and transforming it into a strength. So it's, to cut a long story short, it's something that is at the heart of understanding the power and limits of the contemporary African state itself, which is, you know, a product of colonialism, right? So there is a lot going in there. We don't want to go there. That's another debate.
Thank you.
We may not want to go there, but I've got Lucas Fiala writing me because he doesn't have audio access, so he has to write me a note. Here's the question. Has China learned from the experience of building parliament buildings in these cases? Have they adjusted their approach based on what went right or wrong? I presume that sort of buildings that collapse or problems or more profound things than that.
Yes, I think so, because they sort of like, it's now a thing, right? So they've learned. If you look at the Zimbabwe Parliament building, the latest one that I studied, and compared to the others, so you can see that there's like more coherence and more, you know, it's more like predictable, but also it might also be a function of the relationship that China has with that specific country. I haven't paid attention to the Congo Brazzaville case, but I get a sense that they now know, like, particularly the aspects of the coordination. The coordination used to be quite difficult. So there's the Minister of Commerce, then there's the local embassy involved. So it was not clear who does what in some instances. Who does what? Is it the Chinese companies, contracting companies that have nothing to do with the embassy? because they are contracted by MOFCOM. So I think they've learned in that way. I'm not sure about the what do you call these inbuilt flaws. Whether we might say, because we are still to see whether the Zimbabwe Parliament building does not have the same flaws, but we've already identified the power problem. But what I can say is that there is a sense that it's now a coherent program, because once it is constructed, the National People's Congress now establishes a relationship with that parliament. So there are these structures. It moves from MOFCOM, it moves from being a project, it goes now into the operational side. Now the National People's Congress establishes this relationship with the beneficiary parliament. So yes, they may have learned, but their learning might be like the Bourbons, right? That they forget nothing and learn. It was like, if you see the faults that we see in the Malawi parliament, in the Lesotho parliament, we are sort of like suspecting that with the Zimbabwe parliament again. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I have another question. Thank you very much for the talk. I have a question about whether there has been a concrete backlash against the practice of parliament building and maintenance in the countries where it happened. And I don't know when this was with the African Union buildings, but there was this report of the wires being tapped or not. And I'm wondering whether that had any impact on how this was perceived by the countries that it was offered to from China, and whether there have been perhaps cases where partnerships were ended for maintenance, for example, when there was a change in government or coalition.
Yeah, good question. So the first part of the question about the works, this idea of the wiring, right? I remember there was this big story about wiring, and looks like it was a hoax in a way, right? Because sometimes Western media they like those kinds of stories, right? But if China wants to find stuff, they wouldn't like tape stuff. They would find it elsewhere, right? But like I said, it's about what they do. It's about like they already made a statement that we're here. So the backlash, absolutely no. That's why I said as governments change, it just seems like they are more enamored to China, and the maintenance agreements. They're initially they were supposed to run for 1 year, and then this 1 year, and then the locals take over. But then they've been running for 3 years, and they are renewed almost like every 3 years. And the specific case that I can use in Lesotho. So I spoke to the Minister of Development Cooperation, which coordinates donors. So and I was like, why are the Lesotho artisans not being trained to maintain this building? Then they told me that there was no budget, right? So there's comfort that what they have to do, the Lesotho side, you saw that compound that I showed you. So the Lesotho side only pays for energy, like for that place, and security, right? And then the Chinese pay for the other things. So they say, okay, we'll pick the bill, the security bill for the compound, the maintenance compound, and keep the lights on, and then the Chinese are going to pay everything. So, and governments they've been turned over since that parliament was constructed. 3 governments, different parties coming in, and that arrangement being maintained without a variation.
I think we have covered a lot of ground. I have more questions actually, but it's a bit late at this stage. So thank you very much for sharing thoughts. You've got a book that says it all, so I feel the obligation to market for this book. We'll answer the other questions that you want to hear about this. So thank you very much.